All right, big welcome. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for being here and for sharing the next hour with us for this research launch event co-hosted by More in Common, Center for Houston's Future, and the Leadership Now project. We are eager to get started today and have a lot to pack in as usual. So while we begin introductions, we'd love to hear from you. If you would mind saying hello in the chat using the chat function, your name, your org if you like, and where you're dialing or calling in from, that would be fantastic. We are really grateful to present this research today, just launched on Monday, April 26th. Before I walk us through the rest of the program, two quick things. First and foremost, this event will be recorded and you'll be able to share out afterward with colleagues or your network. And secondly, just a big thank you to our co-host today, the Leadership Now Project and Center for Houston's Future. So before I take the reins from the More in Common team and introduce on our side, I'd like to turn it over first to Center for Houston's Future and the Leadership Now Project to Laura and Daniela to begin intros and share with us who they are. Over to you.
Hi, good morning. Thank you. I'm Laura Goldberg with Center for Houston's Future, and I'll just tell you a little bit about us. We are a 20-year-old nonprofit. We bring business, community, and government leaders together to engage in strategic planning, consensus building, and action around areas of critical importance to the future of Greater Houston. We are currently focusing on immigration, climate and energy, and healthcare. Our work often, but not always, takes on an economic focus. For example, our economic and research on immigration has concluded that immigrants and immigration played a critical role in growing our region's economy, and that immigrants and immigration are simply required to continue that growth ahead. During the event, I'll share some links to our research in the chat, as well as some links to some of the work one of our partners, Rational Middle, has done on immigration. So we've worked with More in Common around immigration in the past, including part of our series of immigration webcasts last year, and we're really excited to see how the threads of Texas can be put to use in all of our core focus areas, including immigration. I just want to give a shout out to my colleague, Betsy Breyer, who is on the line for all her work on immigration as well, and we're really looking forward to the program. Thank you.
Thank you, Laura. Over to you, Daniela.
Thanks so much, Christiana and Laura. Pleasure to be here. I'm Daniela Ballou-Ayres, the CEO of the Leadership Now Project. We're a membership organization of business and thought leaders across the country committed to renewing American democracy. We have members in 25 states and a chapter in Houston. And we were really thrilled to support the work of More in Common on this study to really build an understanding of perspectives on democracy and a range of other issues in Texas. And that's relevant to the work we've been doing across the country, working with academics to understand the state of our democracy and what is needed to strengthen and renew it, and then really enable practical action by business leaders, both within their firms and personally, to use their time and resources to effectively strengthen our country. So really thrilled to be a part of this discussion. And I think More in Common's research here helps provide a common grounding for the ways things need to evolve and change, and where the opportunities are also for bringing people together. So look forward to the conversation.
Thank you, Daniela. And on our side, we will share a little bit more about More in Common through the presentation, but first, just to share who we are. So I'm Christiana Lang. I'm our More in Common's US Senior Associate, which means I get to pair research with the impacts and partnerships like you just heard. And I'll pass over to Dan, Noel, and Coco, who will also be co-presenting today.
Hi, everybody. I'm Dan. I'm the U.S. Director. Really excited to be here. I had the privilege of living in Texas for a year when I was stationed at Fort Hood, so it's been a really wonderful chance to reconnect with this great and interesting state. And I'll pass it over to Noel.
Hi, everyone. I'm Noel. I'm the Senior Researcher for More in Common and the lead researcher for this project. And really, what an absolute honor to know Texas and really know their social psychology, and excited to share that with you all today. Passing it over to Coco.
Hi, everyone. I'm Coco. I'm the research analyst at More in Common US. Super excited to share this research with you all.
Great, thank you, team. And as I mentioned in the beginning, we are going to share a research presentation and just really about the threads of Texas for the next 25 minutes or so. And then we'd like to get into conversation with you. We'll hear questions from you all. So if you have them, grab a pen and a paper and keep it handy for anything that comes up as you listen. So first off, the Threads of Texas is a story of enduring identity in a changing state. I mentioned we have just launched this research on Monday, but this is part of a year-long research study within the state of Texas. Our goal now is to share that study with you and to share ideas on ways to bring this research into impact through really key issue areas that the state and sometimes the country is facing. But first off, a little bit about us. So More in Common is a nonpartisan, nonprofit research and civic organization. And we operate in 4 countries, so France, Germany, the UK, as well as the US. And our main goal is to work on understanding polarization and then how to foster social cohesion and bridging efforts. This includes, as you see on the left, a nod to our Hidden Tribe study in 2018 within the US that has a segmentation different, but in some similarities that you'll see today as far as methodology. Now, More in Common does publish a variety of research studies. We've done upwards of 15 research studies, segmentation studies at the national level. And we also work to bring this through to impact. So whether that's through media engagements, whether that's through communications guidances that supports how to bring this research into communities and into reality. And so you'll see some of that in example today. But before we go into this Threads of Texas study, we want to hear from you. We have a question to begin with. So I'll ask Dan to place a poll if technology is on our side and ask you a question as a Texan related to one of the survey questions we fielded, and we'll share with you the answer shortly. So please take about 20 seconds to answer this daunting question on how much do you agree with the following statement about Texas today? No pressure. We'll leave about 10 more seconds. Great, and we will stop there. So result time, we feel pretty exhausted by the division in politics within Texas. So strongly agree and somewhat agree being the most prominent here. And God bless the 6, 7, 8 of you who somewhat or strongly disagree. We need more of your optimism as well. Great, so we'll stop sharing that poll and we'll get right into it. And we asked that question on exhaustion about how people feel within Texas regarding politics. And here's our answer from really starting and packing with a punch. We asked this question to 4,000 Texans back in August, and this is what was felt. So 83% are exhausted by division in politics, and exhaustion on division doesn't just stay there. It leads to concerns about leading to violence, not just political or election related, but also societal violence. And so really this is the inflection point, or one of many inflection points by which we have decided to field this study and understand more on why this division is occurring and where we can work to bridge together. So why Texas? This is our first state level segmentation study. And I joke, but I'm very serious. I'm not sure what state we would have begun with if not Texas. But it is to do with the inflection point that I just mentioned. That, and there are many different shifts and changes, not only demographic, but also economic and societal happening in Texas right now, making it an ideal place to learn and to really understand what divides Texans, what brings them together. And what we found was this unique and really powerful shared identity of being Texan. We'll go into what we mean by that and how survey responses looked regarding Texas's future and an ideal Texas. A note on methodology, those who are researchers or academics in the room, you will appreciate this, but I will breeze by it quickly. So research-wise, we have fielded a mixed methods approach, so quantitative as well as qualitative. We fielded a 4,000 person state level study in both English and Spanish in August 2020, and a recontact survey just last month within Texas, so a 1,000-person study on that. We also fielded multiple focus groups through thematics, as well as looking into the 7 segments you'll meet shortly. Throughout this research process, we have engaged with organizations within Texas. So partners, core partners and local champions on this to ask questions about what is driving division and what survey questions even should we ask. So that stakeholder engagement was maintained throughout the entire time. Now, key issue areas that we found from speaking with Texans and working with our core partners was what you see here in orange. And so certainly the report in all its 200-page glory goes into key issue areas beyond the ones in orange you see here. But these are the main ones of focus that we'll touch on in this presentation. In the green variables, you see segmentation. And what we mean by this is the process by which we found the 7 threads of Texas were found according to a hierarchical cluster analysis process, which is fancy talk for meaning that the answers to questions around how people think on Texan identity, attitudes towards change, Texas, and political engagement, for example. It's according to those answers on how we segmented and how we found these 7 threads of Texas. Important note here, we did not include any demographics in these 7 threads of Texas. And by doing that, we actually get behind some of the polar opposites and only the half headlines that we see now in Texas. So shortly, I will turn over to Noelle and she will describe these 7 threads of Texas so you can meet them further. But here they are, and the names came about by doing that agglomerative hierarchical cluster analysis process, but then getting to know their personalities and working with partners and then checking in back with these groups through focus groups on how these words and names describe them and how they felt about it. You'll see as well that these 7 threads are differences in percentage. And so some are larger, whereas some are smaller, which becomes important when we look more into some of the survey responses on who is driving conversation and who is often not heard from. On that point, important note that I forgot to mention on methodology was that we surveyed and sampled using the Texan adult population and not the Texan voter population. And that's important because you'll see in a moment that some segments are not often heard from, but still have strong opinions on key issues and sometimes political ideology as well. With that, and for time, I'll pass over to you, Noelle.
Thank you, Christiana. And so now we'll go through each of the 7 segments and I will describe the most salient features for each one. Starting with the Lone Star Progressives, who are about 14% of Texans. So the ideal Texas of Lone Star Progressives is one where people of all races, faiths, and backgrounds feel safe and feel like they belong. They are excited about opportunities they might have in a rapidly changing state. However, they are pessimistic toward the future of Texas society. And some of the underlying reasons for this pessimism is because Lone Star Progressives hardly identify with the more patriotic, liberty-centric Texan identities. This segment has strong ideological views that lean liberal. A salient characteristic of Lone Star Progressives is their feeling of alienation in Texas. In spite of that, they are politically engaged, they're well educated, they are empathetic toward others, and this sort of diminished Texan pride compared to the other segments we'll meet shortly is rooted in this, what they see as a lack of understanding toward historically other groups. They are also the group that is most likely to say they are exhausted by the divisions in politics. All right, so moving on to the civic pragmatists. So like their name suggests, they are optimistic, yet pragmatic when they think about the changing Texas. They're also one of the larger segments that we have. They represent about 1/5 of the Texan population. Civic pragmatists are politically diverse, they're informed, they're engaged. They are concerned with issues of inequality, but especially in focus groups, you can see from their responses that they are practical rather than ideologically extreme, and they seek compromise closer to the political center, which I think this quotation here by Greg about immigration aptly represents. Their ideal Texas is a Texas that is a leader in the knowledge economy industries, as well as a Texas where everyone feels like they can belong. All right, moving on to the Rising Mavericks, our youngest and most ethnically diverse segment. So about 6 in 10 in this category are Gen Z. About a third are immigrants. They're optimistic, but this optimism toward Texas is also nuanced and laced with anxiety. There is financial precarity in this segment because they're younger, but there is a strong sense of upward mobility for themselves. At the same time, even though they're optimistic about their own options, they're ambivalent about their role when they see a rapidly changing Texas. And you can see from these numbers here that half feel excited about the rapid pace, and then the other half feel worried that they will be left behind. Rising Mavericks are proud Texans. For them, however, strong Texan pride and the ability to look at the Texas history critically are not mutually exclusive ideas. For example, the majority believe that Texans should look critically at the state's history of racial injustices such as slavery. All right, so the next segment we have are apolitical providers. So across all of our segments, apolitical providers have the most number of Texans that are worried about being left behind. These are Texans that generally feel detached and disinterested in politics, not born out of a resentment, but mostly because they are balancing so many things. They are providing for their families. They are in essential industries and are working multiple jobs, which is why a lot of them don't engage in politics. They have the lowest % of registered voters and the lowest activity in civic life. The majority are female, also lower income. They are ambivalent about the drivers of change in Texan economy. And as you can see here, this is the highest number you will see about the sentiment of worrying that they will not see themselves playing a role in the future of Texas. Although that being said, their values are one of equality. So you can see here that 88% believe that to be truly Texan, you must believe in equality. Okay, so moving on to the diehard Texans. Diehard Texans are optimistic, fierce Texan pride. They are a group deeply connected with their Texan identity and their communities. So this optimism here is really rooted in this sort of protectiveness toward the history of Texas, where it's going, where it's been, and their role in it. The majority believe, 89% believe that America would be better if more states will be like Texas. And while they recognize, for example, that anyone can be Texan, they are also the group that most strongly believe that to be truly Texan, you have to bide your time in Texas, spend some time in Texas, and really know the culture. Diehard Texans lean conservative, although they are not actively engaged. And I think this quote by Lydia here captures the sentiment of diehard Texans very well. There's no such thing as a white Texan or a non-white Texan. You're either Texan or you're not. All right, so we found across the research that faith plays a critical and multifaceted role in Texas. So around 70% of Texans say that religion is important in their lives, regardless of their orientation or ideological beliefs. For this segment, however, we chose to name them Reverend Texans because their religious identity intersects very strongly with their Texan identity. So as a group, they are most likely to say that religion is very salient in their lives. They have the highest church attendance rate and the highest participation in religious activities. So Reverend Texans is also one of our larger groups, about a fifth of Texans, similar to civic pragmatists. And compared to other Texans, they are similarly optimistic and proud. And their ideal Texas is one that proudly upholds its traditional values. These Texans are solidly conservative. They are politically engaged. And for them, they feel excited about the future of Texas, although that future for them still has to fit with their idea of tradition. And then moving on to our last segment, the heritage defenders. So heritage defenders are in the spectrum of left to right. They are another conservative leaning segment, although unlike the previous segment of Reverend Texans, they are markedly less optimistic. So you can see here that 59% are excited, 41% say that they will be left behind. Heritage defenders value individualism and personal responsibility. They, like I think I already said this, they are politically engaged, although there's a strong undercurrent of skepticism toward the government. So heritage defenders construe Texas identity and this idea of Texanness as an idea to be preserved and a fixed identity that newcomers should adapt to. There is also a sense of embattlement, or I'm feeling embattled and exhaustion in this segment, and a sense of losing what they view as an authentic Texas. So those are all 7 segments. I know I sort of breezed through that, but hope you got a good idea of where you fit or where you think your other friends fit, which I think I will ask in a poll right now. So hopefully technology works for us a second time. So just curious, show of hands, or I guess show of clicks, which segment do you most identify with personally? All right, so we're seeing Lone Star Progressives, Civic Pragmatists, some Rising Mavericks, and Reverend Texans. Oh, and then also, I guess this would be a good opportunity to say that this quiz is also appended in the website, which you can also take it there or share it with your friends and have them take it as well. And with that, I think I'll turn over to Dan to talk about the key issues.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Noel. And what we can share up the results of that poll at the end. It'll be interesting. Okay, diving right in. So now we're just going to show how these 7 threads show up on some of the key issues that are animating politics and culture in Texas. So the first issue we look at is race. And so here we ask the question about whether the crimes of slavery in Texas's past should be left alone or continue to look critically. And you can see a 55-45 split at the state average in terms of with that slight majority saying left alone. And you can see how the 7 threads, 4 of them majorities of support the idea that it should be left alone. What we found is interesting is when we ask a question about race in contemporary Texas. So here we asked this question actually in March of 2021. And you can see that 56% of Texans say that racism continues to be a significant issue in Texas today. And what's notable is you see the shift among apolitical providers and diehard Texans, where they go from a majority saying crimes of slavery should be left alone to supporting the idea that racism continues to be a significant issue in Texas today. And it just shows that for those 2 segments who are not often heard at all in politics, the distinction between is the framing around Texas history and that very strong Texan identity that they identify with, or about kind of looking at the world that they see and they experience today, and those distinctions in terms of how they respond to the survey points. Next, we look at immigration. And so here what we show is the salience in understanding the debate around immigration when we look at the lens of identity. And so here we're showing responses on whether or not immigration is viewed as good or bad for Texas, based upon how respondents answered to these questions about Texan identity. So the importance of being born in Texan, for example, or welcoming diversity. And you can see that there's a very strong correlation among Texans who subscribe to that more traditional identity of being Texan, having a negative assessment of immigration's impact on the state, versus those who identify more with the welcoming diversity component of being Texan have a very positive view of immigration. And despite all of these distinctions and differences, what we actually find is there is unanimity across all 7 threads that the current system is overly complex and that it hinders people who are trying to come to the country legally. And so that's just about 8 out of 10 Texans subscribe to this notion that the current system just isn't working and is hurting or impeding people who want to come to the state through an authorized process. Next, we ask about democracy. And so we ask the question, how much do you agree with this statement? Democracy may be imperfect, but is better than any form of government. And you can see very strong consensus. 8 out of 10 Texans say, yes, I agree that it is better than any other form of government. This mirrors pretty strongly what we see when we ask this country at the national level. And it does speak to the difficulty in understanding the debates around specific democracy reforms or voting rights proposals, because you can see here that Lone Star progressives, heritage defenders, who are ideological opposites, have a comparable degree of support for this statement. And what is also notable is that even though it's only 30%, the threads that have the lowest level of agreement are the rising mavericks and apolitical providers. So segments that lean young, but also less engaged in politics. And so there is this sense of, is this a system they are part of before they can accurately or even, I think, comprehensively assess, is it good or is it bad? And here we get into maybe some of the reasons why. And so we ask about some of the issues related to democracy in Texas. And so you can see here that the top concern shared kind of across more or less all 7 threads is the extent to which money is controlling the political agenda. So 53% of Texans overall, with majorities of almost all of the threads agreeing with that being a concern. But then you can also get into and see how some of these issues are actually being very polarized or received in a very polarized way. So the concern about media being unreliable and one-sided, 45% of Texans overall agree with that, but it's close to 9 out of 10 heritage defenders and 7 out of 10 reverend Texans, whereas only 2 out of 10 Lone Star progressives see that as an issue. Similarly, when we move down and we look at lack of voting access or suppression, 26% of Texans overall say this as an issue, but 66% of Lone Star progressives say this is a huge concern, versus only below 1 in 10 heritage defenders. So again, it speaks to the depth of polarization among the most ideological segments when it comes to issues of our democracy. And then we wanted to kind of close the issue section with 2 results that we found from March 2021. So here we ask questions specific to the most recent energy crisis. And what's notable here is, 1, the extent to which the crisis and the response of neighbors in particular, I think, and local businesses in Texas underscored for 9 out of 10 Texans saying, this was really reminded that no matter our political beliefs, as Texans, we have to rely on each other and work together. What we also found is interesting is that sense of recognition of the import of the crisis. 8 out of 10 Texans say that we need a stronger energy system, even if that requires more regulation, which I think is a pretty unusual finding, because generally when you insert the word regulation, you tend to have a polarized response. It's also notable in the same poll that we had this pretty striking finding around the consensus behind needing a stronger, more robust energy system. Close to 6 in 10 Texans said they don't feel like the climate movement cares about the well-being of people like them. So there is this moment and an opening that Texas has, I think, to approach the issue of energy with a new dynamic, but it doesn't necessarily mean that people are seeing the debate about climate in an entirely new lens. And with that, I'll turn it over to Coco.
Thank you, Dan. And with that, let's turn to the future of Texas and what Texan identity means in a rapidly changing state. So as we all know, Texas is at the forefront of change in the country, especially with more businesses and people moving to the state. And a majority of Texans are excited for the new opportunities they might have. However, when we look at the segmentation, we can see that optimism or pessimism toward the future does not clearly map onto ideological groupings. For example, looking at Reverend Texans and heritage defenders, they might have very similar voting patterns, but here, as you can see, Reverend Texans are much more optimistic. On the other hand, Lone Star progressives, although they feel negatively about Texas society, they're the most enthusiastic about new opportunities. And one last note on this graph, even the apolitical providers who are most prone to financial instability are still somewhat excited for new opportunities. Here you can see that despite Texans' different emotional orientation toward change and their different beliefs on key issues, as Dan has just highlighted, we see here that all Texas threads overwhelmingly believe that a love of freedom, equality, diversity, and neighborliness is crucial to Texan identity. We often see in the news and social media that Texan identity is often used as a wedge to divide, but the convergence here captures how it can actually be a crucial common ground to unite all Texans and encourage everyone to recognize the humanity in each other. As you can see in the next slide, no matter what their opinions are on social and political issues, the majority of Texans believe that their ideal Texas is one where people of all backgrounds feel safe and like they belong. This shared vision of ideal Texas could be a powerful vehicle to unite all Texans. And as the pandemic and the winter power crisis has shown us, Texas is at an inflection point. It can either go down a path of bitter division, or it can build on common ground and find a place where everyone can belong. Here we see that across all the threads, Texans believe that they have more in common than divisions. We hope that this research study, Threads of Texas, a story of enduring identity in a changing state, can contribute to a deeper understanding of Texas in the 2020s and beyond. And with this research, we hope to support efforts to build a thriving Texan future and celebrate what we all have in common. And with that, please check out our English and Spanish report where you can find more insights on Texas. You can also go to our website, threadsoftexas.us, for a quick look at key findings, segment profiles, and key issues. We also encourage you to take our segmentation quiz. It's really fun. And you can see which Texas thread you or your family and friends belong to. And my colleague Kelsey will share the links in the chat. Before I turn it back to Christiana, I want to show you a snapshot of the support we're getting from organizations and individuals from very different demographics and ideologies. And the narratives that seem to be sticking here are Texans want change, but in a Texan way. And there is a set of shared values and identity that unite all Texans despite disagreement or differences. And in the upcoming weeks and months, we will share additional survey findings and communications guidance. So please subscribe to our newsletter on threadsoftexas.us and stay informed. If you have any questions, ideas, or thoughts on bringing research to impact, please reach out to us. And with that, I'll turn it back to Christiana.
Thank you, Coco. Thanks, Noelle. Thanks, Dan. We are hoping you're still with us, and I'm seeing already chat questions coming through. So thank you, and keep those coming. That was a lot of graphs. That was a lot of research, and we are really eager to get into discussion with you. Before we do, and while you're typing those questions in using the Q&A function, I would like to invite Laura and either Daniela or Lakshmi from Leadership Now and Center for Houston's Future to kick us off with some questions that you all might have.
Sure. I will start with an immigration-focused question. So I would say, what lessons from the Texas-focused research on immigration can we learn about the prospects for immigration reform nationwide? And what steps should we be taking in Texas around immigration to build common narratives and consensus?
Thank you, Laura, for that question. And that is certainly a topic of great importance right now for Texas and also for the whole country, as you mentioned. I think Dan and Noelle have some ideas on ways to answer this best, but appreciate the work that you're all doing at Center for Houston's Future on this thread, and eager to learn with you and from you and can contribute to those efforts as well.
Sure. So it's a great question, Laura, and I'll just kick things off. So one of the first findings, thinking about Texas and recognizing that there's a lot of business leaders on the call today, is that Texans are looking for business leaders to have a voice in the immigration debate. 68% of Texans agree that business should have a more salient voice in kind of affecting or shaping immigration in the country. But at the same time, as we kind of showed with that one slide, the concerns or some of the division around immigration is not necessarily about economics or economic insecurity, as it is around identity and national security more generally. And so thinking about that dynamic might mean that business leaders can play a voice in actively speaking to some of the economic figures, but that also we need to create spaces where that segment, like diehard Texans, they're not going to show up to a political event because they don't like politics, they're very frustrated by politics, but they might come to an event that's more social or relational, and having their voice at the table would, I think, reduce some of the toxicity that can emerge in a debate about immigration, particularly if it's framed around what it means to be Texans. We also found 74% of Texans are proud of their state's history as a place of immigrants. So speaking to that Texan identity with a segment like diehard Texans really is a way to connect with them on a debate that they might not engage with politically. But I'll pass it over to Noelle.
I think Dan answered that comprehensively. The only thread that I will follow on further is that Texans are aware that immigration is an issue that's politicized and that the narrative is controlled for gains that may be outside the issue itself. For example, political gains. And so, like Dan was saying, a lot of Texans are turned off by participating in town hall and immigration when it's the politicians who will be directing that narrative. But when you get to conversations around relationships with communities or the role of immigration or immigrants in Texan society and the history, then there's a lot more openness and willingness to be involved in that. So yeah, and so like we also have a data point that we did not show that asks whether Texans think media is politicizing these issues, and the data point on that is also upwards of like 70%. So
Great. Thank you, Dan. Thank you, Noel. Thank you, Laura, for the question. And I see Q&As coming in. I see some using the chat function sneakily. Thank you. We'll get to them. And then those of you who have submitted questions in the Q&A, we're going to pop those over so everyone can see them in just a moment, and feel free to keep them coming. Before we turn over though, Lakshmi, if you would mind, if you had a question on your mind regarding LNP's work, I'd love to hear.
Yeah, thank you. This is great information. There's a ton of information here. And, I think nationally, and even, in Texas and other states, we're seeing business leaders step up and, voice their concerns around voting rights, civic engagement. And so my question is really around what advice, given these threads, given the demographic shift, what advice do you have with business leaders as they communicate with their communities around the benefits and access to civic engagement?
Yeah, thanks, Lakshmi. It's an important question. And I know that a lot of people on the call right now are from the business community, of course, and so relevant, extremely relevant to everyone here. One thing that I'll start off with and pass over to Noelle and then Dan would be just to know that business leaders are trusted messengers and have great influence. And maybe you know that as a business leader, but research also proves and shows it, as we saw, for example, within election integrity work. And so findings in Texas on other key issue areas are no different. So encouraging just first and foremost business leaders to step up in that role and be those trusted messengers within local communities as they are would be the first place to start. And then turning to Dan and Noelle further.
okay, I'll follow up and then pass to Dan. Yeah, just this idea, we heard this from focus groups that business leaders are directly engaging with Texans whose views may not be reflected in the most prominent dialogue on different issues like statewide or nationwide, especially, for example, when we think about the apolitical providers who are passive and disinterested in politics, but the people they come in contact with are their employers or their colleagues. And so those conversations can provide like the step or foot in the door for more civic engagement. And then passing it over to Dan.
Yeah, no, just to kind of build on what Noel and Christiana just said. So a few stats from the research. So 58% of Texans agree that it's a citizen's right to vote and that voting should be as easier and seamless versus it's kind of a duty and responsibility. But the support for that comes from the groups which have a more left or liberal ideology, but then also a group like diehard Texans and apolitical providers. So it is, again, it speaks to this. Part of the reason we do this segmentation approach is we want to get away from just seeing people on a left-right spectrum and saying, oh, you're liberal, conservative, or a centrist. Like that's just, there's a map around intensity of engagement that speaks to, are you connected to a system at all? Do you understand yourself as being a liberal, or conservative, or a centrist? Or do you think of yourself first and foremost as a Texan or somebody from community A, which is a town or a city? And so business leaders, again, have widespread support for engaging on issues of civic participation. But if we can find new ways to reach people, not through overtly or explicitly political means, we're going to open up more space for some of those threads that have enthusiasm for kind of increasing civic participation, but aren't excited to come into the political debate as currently framed.
Great, thank you. Go ahead, Lakshmi, did you have a follow-up?
I just said thank you.
Oh, great, super. And feel free, Leadership Now team, to pop anything you like in the chat as well along that question and along that thread. And thank you for asking. So we have quite a few questions. We will not get to all of them, but we may be able to do follow-ups offline. So thank you for sending them in. We'll start off with a question on Hugh. So Hugh, you've asked a question. I'm going to make it live so everyone can see. I think, can everyone see that? Great. So Hugh asks, do you think there's an opportunity for unifying versus divisive political leaders to emerge and get elected? So this question is based on kind of opportunity to unify and work within political levels as well. So great question, Hugh, thank you. The purpose of this research is, of course, first to understand the points of division and the points of unity, and then work on how to support this unifying lens that you've now applied to the political leaders level. So the short answer is yes, absolutely, there is an opportunity here. And I think a lot of that is first and foremost to understand Texans in a different way beyond demographics, and some of the Texans that you now know, apolitical providers, for example, who are not often heard or don't feel bought in. Connecting that group with political leaders would be one place to begin. Our focus is not so much on politics at all. Of course, we're nonpartisan and we're not focused on getting anyone elected, but we are focused on ensuring that this research of what is out there, what unifies Texans, is supportive both of the political community, of the civil society community, the academic, and so on. Dan and Noel, did you want to add?
I would just totally agree with Christiana, absolutely. And the truth is, like, they're already out there. They tend to be at more local levels because there are structural conditions. A two-party system does mean that there's dynamics that are unique within each party, that in terms of what kinds of actors can get elected. But at the same time, what we have consistently found, both at the national level, but especially true in Texas, is this appetite. I mean, the concern about division in politics fueling violence, that's close to 9 out of 10 Texans. That's very salient. This isn't just about Texans being nicer to each other or kind of being more civil, although that might be good. It's actually this recognition that our democracy depends on people who have different political views being able to come together, recognize our shared identity as Texans or as Americans, and resolve our differences amicably and peaceably and through democratic processes. And that you can do that on the left, you can do it on the right. And there's enormous appetite for that often gets obscured when we just look at headlines and we see this intense division between a left and a right camp.
Apologize, this light behind me keeps turning off. I must be too still. Great, thank you, Dan. And I'm going to turn over next to Fred's question. This one I think we can get to quickly. So the 7 segments are fascinating. Thank you, we think so too. Were there subordinate segments that came out in the hierarchical analysis? I think this one has Noel's name all over it.
I'll take this question. It's an agglomerative cluster analysis, which means that each single data point is its own clusters, and then the machine learning then clusters it into those that are most similar. I guess the theoretical answer is that the superordinate segment is the Texan identity. That's what came out. But in a statistical methodological sense, you would get as a superordinate segment if you started out with a divisive hierarchical analysis where you're starting from a big chunk that's further divided. And yeah, I can follow up with like stats talk all day, but that's the answer for that.
Great, thank you, Noelle, and thank you for the question. Next is John Steiner, and it says Margot King as well, giving us some praise, thank you. And what kind of outreach are you getting or planning or hoping to get in Texas media? And so Coco shared our last slide of 4 op-eds that have been, well, 3 op-eds and then one article that has been published so far. Our hope is to get this research out into the world. It's not to keep it online tucked away for only a select few to read. The intent of this research is really to bring it to impact. And so John asks, might you be planning to bring together representatives of the various segments for conversation and efforts to reach common ground? So the opposite of the last question, less on research and more on practice and impact. And so I'll answer this one, John. Yes, absolutely. And you've put forth an idea in and of itself, and that is exactly the purpose and point. It is to get to know Texans in different ways and to understand what drives them, what their values are, and where those commonalities are. The bringing together portion, it's complicated with COVID, of course, but organizations within Texas are already doing such great work. This methodology and this research can layer into and onto that work that people are already doing, whether it's immigration work or education or civic engagement, for example. So our plan absolutely is to continue presentations like this and to work on workshops and trainings, ways to get this out into the world, not only in media, but with partners as well. Okay, great. I'm going to find the next lucky person. So Jim's question on media sources. So I think this one goes, my biggest concern, so Jim, my biggest concern as far as a root cause of the political and ideological division is the misinformation that's more widely spread by social media. Did you survey each segment about where they're most likely to seek information upon which to form opinions? Jim, this is a really excellent question. And yes, the answer is yes, we did. I don't know if we have that slide available right now. We can absolutely follow up if you want to place your email in a direct message. We can get back to you on that. But Dan and Noelle, if you want to come in on this answer.
So we did, yeah, we have the data on media and news consumption, and some of it would map to what you might expect in terms of consuming ideological or outlets that are more commonly associated with liberal or conservative viewpoints. And the other distinction is the Texans who don't, like, again, I think we have a tendency to overestimate the degree to which people we disagree with politically consume a singular outlet, right? So even among our segments, like not every heritage defender is actively consuming Fox News. Not every Lone Star progressive is actively consuming MSNBC. And as we get to like the rising mavericks, the apolitical providers, the diehard Texans, it's a much more diverse and less ideological set of outlets. You see a higher rate of consumption for things like ABC, NBC, CBS. And then the only other finding that I would point out is one of the questions we ask is the frequency, or have you shared political content on social media? And it's a salient finding because it's the Lone Star progressives and heritage defenders who are about 2 times as likely to say yes. And so if you are going to Twitter to try and derive your sense of political viewpoints in Texas or the conversation in Texas, you're going to see an outsized influence of those more ideological segments relative to the segments, the threads that are just not on Twitter sharing political content.
Great. Okay, that answers that one. And thank you for the question. Absolutely getting a lot of praise for that question. It's an important one. And I see your comment in the chat, so thank you. The next one, and we're rifling through these, that's great. So the next one is from Stephen. Do you have a sense for which threads are likely to grow versus shrink in size in the coming years? It's a question on demographics, of course. And are rising mavericks and progressive activists growing? And are reverent Texans and heritage defenders on the decline? And this is also paired with a question that I think Godswill also asked as well on demographic breakdowns of the 7 segments. And so I'll mark that one as well. So we do have a sense of what the demographics look like throughout each of these segments. We know that information. The main point is that there are demographics spread across all of the different segments. So each segment holds all demographics, for example, male, female, different races, different ages, different geographies, rural, urban, suburban. And so when looking at the age specifically throughout the different segments, so you bring up Rising Mavericks, we noted that 2/3 are under the age of 24. That's significant. So yes, those are the young Texans, and there is a demographic shift occurring of people coming to Texas and moving to Texas. The outlier, at least in my mind, is if the people who are coming and moving to Texas are looking to come to a state where their perception of Texas is more conservative, or if they're coming for different reasons, perhaps job opportunities. And so in our data, we do see some answers that point to that. I think age and also the demographic shifts of people coming to Texas, whether for whatever reason, that's kind of the outlier that will determine. Coco and Noel, Dan, did you want to add there?
So the only thing I would say in terms of the growth or decline of the threads is part of the reason we don't use demographics as an input variable is because someone, the Rising Mavericks, for example, someone might be on the younger side, but where they go directionally, we can't quite predict that simply by knowing their age or their race or ethnicity, right? So like whether somebody who is currently 24 turns into a diehard Texan, a reverent Texan, or a Lone Star progressive, civic pragmatist, like these segments that we have much more enduring value because the predictive value of demographics is just not as strong as we commonly assume. And so we try and provide this different framework, which has more durability, we think, because it's based on these underlying values about what does it mean to be Texan, what kind of Texas are you hoping for?
Great. Okay, next, going through, so Ivars, you asked 2 questions here, and I'll grab one of them. So Ivar says, you keep referencing Texans in quotations. I'm assuming that you're talking about Texan residents. Living and working in Houston, as others on the call, we live in one of the most diverse cities in the US. Don't know the number, but a lot of people are not native Texans. There's a difference between the two. Can you comment? Thank you so much for that question. So just to reiterate a little on methodology, and then I'll pop it over to Noel perhaps on this one. So our survey and our methodology surveyed all Texan adults within Texas. We know the statistics on self-identification of how long a person's been in Texas, but the scope of who we sampled, it would be all adults within Texas, whether they're native or not. And so because of that, we're able to see who is in Texas right now and what the makeup is right now, because that's the collective that makes up the state. Noel and Coco, do you have any ads there?
Yep, I'll just cite the quick stats. So in the survey, for example, for the 4,000 Texans that we interviewed, 58% were born in Texas, 42% were not, and around those 42%, some have lived there, a third have lived there most of their life, a third half their lives, and then another third within the last 5 years. And then I'll close out this answer by saying that in the report, or when we looked at the identity and just the Texan pride that's really distinct among Texans, it didn't matter much whether you're a newcomer or someone who's born there or someone who's lived there for the majority of your life. The Texan pride was upwards of 65%. And so, which is also one of the points that perhaps surprised us and we thought could be used to really leverage this shared identity and this shared sense of Texanness.
Thanks, Noel. All right. I know we have time for one more, and let's turn to Cole. So Cole says, it seems that the more fringe threads, so the ones on the ends, are less optimistic than the more moderate threads. Is that a fair conclusion? And if so, does your research highlight the future driving force that these fringes are concerned with? Is it the more moderate threads, the opposing fringe, or something else altogether? Specifically, what is and are the futuristic drivers that causes so much pessimism in the fringes, if there's more pessimism there? And so, yes, Cole, you're spot on with that. It seems that there's less optimism on the fringe because that's what the data shows. I'll start with just one answer and then turn it over to team on additional thoughts. So one thing that we do find specifically on civic engagement and politics, for example, so heritage defenders on one poll end and Lone Star progressives on the other poll end, both are experiencing high levels of exhaustion, and both are extremely engaged in politics. And that just so happens also to be on a heavy diet of media, whether that's social media or otherwise. And so those correlate in Texas as they do at the national level as well. So that's one point on the optimism, pessimism spectrum. But Noelle and Dan and Coco, please come in on the rest of the question too.
Yeah, and then just building off from that answer, the roots of pessimism for those ideological threads at the end are different as well. So for Lone Star progressives, for them, change is not coming fast enough. And the change they seek is a change towards the more progressive side. For the heritage defenders, on the other hand, change is coming too fast, and change is really eroding their idea of what Texas used to be and their what they think of as their Texas traditions. And then Dan or Coco.
No, okay, great. So I'm gonna call it just because we only have 2 minutes left and I want to respect everyone's time because you've spent an hour with us and we're very, very grateful. So I see that there are a few more questions we didn't get to. We did get to 8, so that's great. Thank you for the chat as well. We'll follow up with anyone who did put their email in there. A huge thank you, first and foremost, to Center for Houston's Future and the Leadership Now Project for being partners with us on this project, supporting this research, and just being incredible co-hosts as well today, as well as thank you for your work that you do that this research can support, hopefully. Thank you to team, and thank you also to attendees for being here today. Just echoing one thing Coco said earlier, and we'll place back in the chat. So we do have a full report. It's 200 pages. Plans for your weekend are already set. We also have a segmentation quiz, a short version of it, not the 20-minute version we asked survey respondents, but just a 5-minute quiz where you can see which segment would best describe you. We also will be continuing media engagement, and so please feel free to consult the website, threadsoftexas.us, as well as subscribe to our newsletter to get updates on additional research that we'll publish very soon. We're grateful for you all. Thank you, and have a great rest of your Thursday.